You're listening to the Bible as literature.
Hi, this is Father Mark Boulos, and you are listening to Tadazi Tuesdays with the Bible as Literature podcast. This week, Father Paul underscores how the Septuagint's different ordering and classification of texts impact our ability to hear the words of God correctly, shifting the Chronicles from the Ketubim to historical books, reframing them as historical events rather than wisdom writings. The same can be seen with Daniel's placement between Ezekiel and the 12, which undermines its resonance as wisdom literature. I am honored to introduce Father Paul on the Bible as Literature podcast, Tadazi Tuesdays.
The Septuagint has its own canon that disrupts the original canon in the position of the books. That is a very important part of my argument. When you're hearing Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, which are the last books of the Hebrew Bible, within the context of the earlier prophets, you're disturbing the canon. And that's what scholarship does. You compare Chronicles with Kings, and then you say here and there and what they did and so on. But you don't give a serious consideration to the position in the two different canons. Meaning that the Chronicles in the Septuagint are historical books. The Chronicles in the Hebrew canon are Ketubim. And then what for me struck me the most is that Daniel is immediately before the last four books that are under the name of the Chronicle, is also moved between Ezekiel and the 12. So this part of the canon, I think I would have to revisit by giving it its importance. In the last podcast, Mark, in his introduction, underlined that, the text is canonical at the same time. Take even the wording of the Torah. And scholarship has picked on that you don't have a Torah like rules beginning with Exodus, because you could start with Exodus. There were enslaved people that God would. But Genesis, and this long theory, I touched upon it in my previous book, we can revisit it, that Garbini, Italian, tried to solve this dilemma between two top German scholars, von Rad and Martin Noth. The one spoke about a Tetratuch, the other spoke about a Hexatuch. You know that theory, that you have to include Joshua as the end of the story, Hexatuch. The other spoke about the Tetratuch. Now, Garbini said, yes, at the beginning was a Tetratuch, but very intelligent. The priest that came back from Mesopotamia, but again he historicizes here again, wanted to make sure, as in Nehemiah, that they were entitled by writing and promoting a prequel to the Pentateuch, which is the book of Genesis. Now, what I like about his theory that the book of Genesis is really later and it controls everything like Matthew in the New Testament. But he still historicizes it. And his basic point, which is brought up by a lot of people, that the terminology of Ur of the Chaldeans that is found only in Genesis and in Nehemiah. You see, when you stick with the literature, you find important things. Were Chaldeans, when Chaldeans was the Neo-Babylonians. You didn't have Chaldeans before that. My thesis, obviously, is that from the beginning you had a Pentateuch, Torah. Actually, you don't have Pentateuch. But the tripartite, people refer to Luke, but it's already before Luke in the Ecclesiasticus. This is where Ecclesiasticus is important. The law, the prophets, and the other books. Books, again, we have to explain to the people that Ketub does not mean book. It means something written. So the stress, by the way, on the writing is that you have a text. And here, comes again on the horizon the Ugaritic literature, which exists only consonantally. And as I keep repeating, Western scholars were able to translate that and thus understand it. The power in my argument about this, that a similar situation exactly as the scholars of the West reading the Ugaritic literature in the 20th century is still extant until nowadays in the Middle East, whether Israel or the Arab countries. Again, my classic example that I keep repeating, but people look at me as though, well, it's an interesting point. Can you imagine driving in Israel and in Lebanon and reading signs on the highway while you're driving 70 miles an hour? This means that you had to have lots of rest areas where you stop and open your dictionary to figure out what they are saying. It's not so. So that point we need to stress it, that it is a reality that is lived today. And yet the scholars of the West pontificated against Kamal Salibi. I was trained in medical school where you have an organism. The class of anatomy is not about organs, but about organisms, and in detail the organs. The only thing you can do is what the Jews and the Muslims mainly, plus a few Christians, did in the Andalus. People think that he made Eve, created Eve. The originals say he built Eve. And there begins the bad news. In other words, when he took a rib from Adam, he told him, you're a bunch of ribs, but I'm not going to mess with the entire thing. I'll take one of them. So the stone building is already in chapter 2, Habuna. And as a witness, I have Matthew George. When I kept saying, what is this story that Abraham was basically from the beginning a monotheist? No, the Bible said that he followed other gods. And Sarantides technically interrupted me with his way, you know. Enough is enough, Father Paul. Where do you read this in the text? And obviously he had Genesis open before him. And this is not a story because it's an actuality. It goes like this. Father Paul, he was sitting on the last desk. So I had to move in the class between the desks and get to him. And you should see the face of the students, especially Matthew George. And while the Bible was facing him, I flipped the pages and pointed to him a text, which is Joshua 24. But the other students didn't know what I was doing. All they saw is the frozen face of the mighty Sarantides. And they had to go to him during the break and ask him, what did Father Paul do? This is a factual story. Tayyib Abuna, although you don't need my blessings, but you have them, they are free of charge. El Shaddai makes you pay for his blessings. But I'm a freebie.
You've just heard the Bible as literature. Thanks for listening.
The Bible as Literature is a production of the Ephesus School Network.